This video contains Chinese names. I'm going to pronounce these correctly in English, more or less, but not in Chinese. Let me explain. Chinese is a tonal language. The same syllable means something totally different if pronounced with a different tone. Chinese also uses consonants that are not distinguished between in English. The pinyin romanization system does allow for the denotation of the 5 tones, and it also indicates all of the different consonants, but in academic writing, the standard is not to include the tonal marks. As a result, Chinese names in English are normally pronounced without regard to tone. Often enough, they are also pronounced without regard to the correct consonant sounds. The result is total gibberish to Chinese ears, but that's what you'll find in this video. You've been warned. Ever since I was a kid, I heard stories about the notorious Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. In his reign, he standardized weights and measures, ending centuries of war, but he burned books and buried scholars alive. Later, he was entombed in a massive complex full of mercury, precious metals, jewels, and booby traps, with dozens of innocent people sealed inside to die along with him. I was in a class once that watched some of a documentary about him. It wasn't all that great. The students got a kick out of this line.
His advisors plan what to do with his empire. Once his poisoned body has gone the way of his poisoned mind.
Whoa! Yo! Two!
Today, the first emperor is probably most famous for the terracotta army he constructed to guard his tomb. The first emperor, the infamously cruel tyrant who unified a great nation, but at what cost? Or, as new perspectives have formed, was he really a heroic, but perhaps tragic figure, striving for peace the only way he could? So, after all these years, I finally decided to go to the source and read the classic account. Sima Qian, a name for the ages. Sima Qian, grand historian in the court of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, died in 87 BCE. He left us a great legacy, the Shiji.
How is the title correctly pronounced?
史记.
Thank you.
Welcome.
The Shiji is a book normally known in English as Records of the Grand Historian. What makes the Shiji so important? At the time of its composition, it was the most thorough, careful treatment of Chinese history ever. Sima Qian's goal was to chronicle all Chinese history from remote antiquity to the present day. Obviously, that present day was about 2,100 years earlier than ours, but the book still covers about 2,000 years of events and personages. Sima Qian spent 18 years working on this book. He lived for its composition. Here's the book I'm going to be talking about in this video. It's just a selection. Here's the full text in the original Chinese. Just kidding. Here's the full text. The Shiji is long. Really, really long. As far as I know, there's only one complete English language translation by William H. Nienhauser, Jr. Impressive name. Regrettably, he uses the Wade-Giles romanization system. Judging from the page counts on Amazon, his translation is more than 3,100 pages. The Chinese edition of the Shiji in my collection tallies in at 2,918 pages. Wow, that is the longest book I've ever heard of. Besides the work of Vinicius Leoncio, who is trying to put all of Brazil's tax laws into one book, the book already weighs 7 tons, as much as an elephant, and the Brazilian state is adding more often contradictory tax laws every day. This is worth mentioning since bureaucracy will be a recurring theme in this video. What I read is a publication put out by Columbia University Press, Records of the Grand Historian Qin Dynasty. I have a hardcover edition, although it's a cheap plastic-style hardcover, the pages glued in. I'd prefer something sturdier. These ugly creases weren't there originally. I left the book out on an extremely hot day once, and the plastic film over the cover warped. Whoops. I put up that disclaimer about Chinese pronunciations earlier, but okay. I'll show you one correct pronunciation of Qin before the video is over.
Qin.
This is a selection from Records of the Grand Historian, selected and translated by Burton Watson. Included are translations of the Basic Annals of Qin, the Basic Annals of the First Emperor of the Qin, and biographies of various important figures related to the state of Qin. Pretty much all of the classic stories about the first emperor are here: the assassination attempt by Jing Ke, the burning of the books, the first emperor's corpse being kept secret, etc. The book also filled in some blanks I was not fully aware of previously, such as where Xiang Yu entered the stage as the rebel leader, or the identity of the minister that endorsed the burning of the books. I might be getting ahead of myself, though. While these stories are well known to me, my impression is that they are not so well known to everybody. Certainly outside of China. And there are lots of stories I never knew before, too. Time for a history lesson. Preceding the Qin dynasty was the Zhou. In the words of Burton Watson, the Zhou, which was probably founded around 1045 BC, appears to have exercised fairly effective control over a wide area of northern China in the early years of its rule. But later, particularly after its capital was moved east to Liueyang in 770 BC, its power rapidly waned, and China was thereafter ruled by a number of feudal states that acknowledged nominal fealty to the Zhou king, but in fact behaved as virtually independent political units. Depending on how you want to define Chineseness, some might say it wasn't China yet. These governments vied for dominance for hundreds of years. For this reason, historians call this the Warring States period, whose many intrigues become so numerous and complex they could rival Europe's prior to the First World War. Prior to the Warring States period was the Spring and Autumn period, though apparently there is no strict division between them. Qin was one of the states, located in the west, with some ties to the Rung and Yi barbarians. The Basic Annals of Qin is the dry part of the book. This deals with the origins of the state, and then describes each duke and later king, as well as their deeds. The early passages trace the ancestors of the Qin to the mythical era of the Xia dynasty, women being impregnated from swallowing bird eggs and that kind of thing. But we're on the Zhou dynasty within 3 pages. Most of this section is organized by the year of the reign, as dates were measured in Sima Qian's day. Not even 10 pages in, Duke Wen is already promulgating the form of the death penalty, wherein the criminal's 3 sets of relatives are put to death along with them. I recall reading somewhere that this sometimes resulted in whole villages being put to death for the crime of one person. Certainly encourages people not to snitch. Also, if someone committed a pettier crime, since they and their families would be put to death if they were caught anyway, they already have nothing to lose. They might as well continue committing every other crime that warrants a death penalty. Though, in practice, someone expecting to be sentenced to the death penalty would often kill themselves to spare their family, and thus still be taken out of the picture. The contents of the Basic Annals of Qin are mostly descriptions of battles and negotiations, virtuous advisors, and the campaigns of generals. For example, from page 17, in his 36th year, Duke Mu once more bestowed favors on Meng Ming and the other commanders and sent them to lead troops in an attack on Jin, burning their boats behind them when they crossed the Yellow River. They inflicted a crushing defeat on the men of Jin, seizing the cities of Wangguan and Jiao, and thus repaying Jin for the Battle of Yao. The people of Jin all kept to their cities and did not venture forth. Frequently, Sima Qian also mentions important events with other states and the Zhou kings, not that much major was happening with the Zhou at this point, in order to help give a sense of what was going on throughout the country at that point. Duke Mu, incidentally, is very important. He ruled from 659 to 621 and was a mighty leader, expanding the state and becoming a ruler of the Rung. Later regarded as virtuous, a model ruler for the Qin, he was responsible for many deaths, like most heads of state. I believe that he's also regarded as one of the 5 hegemons of the Spring and Autumn period. So to be clear, Duke Mu is from the Spring and Autumn period, not the Warring States period. And I'm going to avoid distinguishing between these 2 periods for the rest of this video. One of the more interesting narratives from the section concerning Duke Mu involves what the text calls a group of 300 or more rustics in the region of Mount Che. Apparently, they captured one of the Duke's prized horses and ate it. When the rustics were to be punished, Duke Mu intervened, deciding to be merciful, since one must not let one's animals hurt other people. Instead, he gives them wine to wash down the horse meat and pardons them. Later, in a battle with the state of Jin, the enemy had Duke Mu and his troops pinned down. Duke Mu was injured, but these people from Mount Che intervened and saved him, as a way of repaying him for saving them. Some of the events the history chooses to include are interesting, like abnormal weather events or the appearance of comets. These would have been taken as omens, of what I'm not sure, but probably not of anything good. Also highly important is the reign of Duke Xiao about 300 years later. Duke Xiao isn't important so much as his advisor, Wei Yang, later Lord Shang, a powerful statesman who promulgated the system of laws that would become so characteristic of Qin. Records of the Grand Historian Qin Dynasty incorporates the selected biographies as the final section. Instead of covering the sections of the book in order, though, I'll describe some of the interesting bits in a more organic sequence. Wei Yang was a member of the ruling family in the state of Wei. No, not that other Wei. There were two states called Wei. In Chinese, they're clearly differentiated because of their different tones. Watson, to avoid confusion in English, romanizes them differently. The state of Han also receives this treatment to avoid confusion with the unrelated Han dynasty that eventually emerged from the civil war following the collapse of Qin. So, history spoilers. Also, the way in which Wei Yang was born is also frequently called Yang. What was I saying? Ah yes, Wei Yang. He is also known as Gongsun Yang and Shang Yang, but is usually known as Lord Shang, though in this book he is often simply referred to as Yang. That's pretty confusing, you say. Why shouldn't it be simpler? Same reason English has the letter C, even though it's totally redundant with the letters K and S. It should be simpler, but it's not. Though Wei Yang is known as Lord Shang because he was later made Lord of Shang after defeating the forces of his home state Wei on Qin's behalf. In doing so, he betrayed his old friend Gengzi Ang, the enemy general, whom Wei Yang tricked into believing he didn't want Wei and Qin to fight. Yeah, Wei Yang wasn't the nicest guy. Lord Shang is an influential figure not only in the history of Qin, but in the history of China as a whole. Before Lord Shang's day, there was less written law and more custom, tradition, and ritual. There was also the idea embodied in Confucian philosophy that a government should control the public through benevolence. A good ruler would not need to conquer. The people would come to him of their own volition. In practice, states didn't run this way, but there was a sense that they should. Not to Lord Shang, though. He advocated supreme government power. The people were to be controlled through force and authority as per a new code of laws of his creation. Lord Shang encouraged Duke Xiao to adopt these written laws to be applied equally and clearly to everyone in the state, regardless of rank. Don't think this is because of a democratic humanitarian spirit. These laws were as ruthless as Hammurabi's and came in huge number, or so later historians would lead us to believe. China probably has a longer history of bureaucracy than any other nation on Earth, and Lord Shang is one of the founders of this proud tradition of Byzantine regulation. Lord Shang is regarded as a proponent of what is known in English as the legalist philosophy, which generally encourages the strict enforcement of laws with harsh penalties. In Qin, criminals are marked with tattoos, mutilated, the death penalty was handed out liberally, etc. And keep in mind that when someone was sentenced to death, their spouse, children, brothers, and parents were also killed. Once I went to a restaurant with some friends of mine. There was a McDonald's across the street. The owners of the restaurant we were in warned us that we should not have parked at the McDonald's because if we did, our car'd be towed. The restaurant didn't have a car park, you see, unlike the McDonald's. Now, we didn't park there, But imagine forcing someone to go through the trouble of having their car impounded just because they parked at McDonald's. Isn't that overkill? Now, that's pretty petty in comparison to the kind of regulations Lord Shung advocated, but these are the kinds of punishments he'd think a good idea for the crime. Maybe chop off their nose and ears while we're at it. Interestingly, if an official recommends someone else to an office and the newcomer performs poorly, it's not the bad official who's to be punished, but the man who recommended him. I guess it would discourage nepotism. Lord Shung also reformed the tax system, mandated military service for all citizens, recognized private property rights for citizens, etc. On the more positive side, he standardized weights and units of measure in Qin. This would become a theme. Sima Qian tells us that, in the first year of the new laws, the people of Qin complained bitterly. The people of Qin poured into the capital complaining that the new laws were unsuitable and numbered in the thousands. Apparently the problem with the laws was, as Young puts it, that the officials were leading the way in breaking them. To make an example, Young brought the heir apparent in for tattooing. I assume tattooing of the face, permanently marking him as a criminal. Oddly, I don't think Sima Qian ever indicates what crime the heir apparent committed. The heir apparent being the future ruler couldn't be punished, and so his tutor was tattooed in his place. This actually demonstrates precisely the peasants' problem with the laws, namely that the leadership is not punished for violating them. But apparently this was good enough for the public, as after this the laws became quite popular. At least for a few years. After a decade as prime minister, Lord Shung ended up speaking with a man named Zhao Liang. As Sima Qian presents it, Zhao Liang gave a lengthy monologue warning Lord Shung that he shouldn't be so keen on punishing people. When you became prime minister of Qin, you failed to act on behalf of the 100 families, but instead built elaborate structures such as the Memorial Gate, which is hardly a deed of merit. You inflicted tattooing and other punishments on the tutor and teacher of the heir apparent and brought mutilation and injury to the people with your harsh penalties. Zhao Liang warned Lord Shung that he must respect tradition. He even quotes the Book of Odes in the Book of Documents. He's such a good Confucian, I expect he may be an invention of later Confucian writers, or at least the episode was expanded upon in the imagination of the literati. Zhao Liang's advice was to help the poor, the hermits, the orphans, and to retire to the country, rather than punish Qin's people and incur the hatred of the noble families from his post governing the state. Of course, being a stubborn old bureaucrat, Lord Shung ignored the advice. A few months later, Duke Xiao died. Remember the heir apparent's teacher, the one whose face was tattooed? His name was Gengzi Chan. He and his allies plotted against Lord Shung, who fled the country for Wei, the land of his birth. And now that he's fled, of course Gengzi Chan and the state of Qin have to recognize him as a traitor. But now that Lord Shung is returned to Wei, the people hate him, because he betrayed Gengzi Ang. So instead, Wei turned him over to Qin. As per his own code of laws, Lord Shung was killed and his body torn apart with carriages. Afterwards, as Sima Qian tells us, the whole of Lord Shung's family was wiped out. It was 338 BCE. Lord Shung was a man endowed by heaven with a cruel and unscrupulous nature. According to Sima Qian's account, Lord Shung was also insincere in his politics, only preaching what kept Duke Xiao from falling asleep. It's funny to imagine an ancient Chinese nobleman nodding off to a busybody's lectures, but I try to keep in mind that these few people affected so many lives, and the humor is somewhat mitigated. History's full of stuff like this. Two wrongs don't make a right, but I find Lord Shung's biography interesting. It reads like a short story with a clear point to make about human relations. Yet, by knowing it, I not only know a good story, but also history. Frequently the biographical sections of this book, including the basic annals of the first emperor, read almost novelistically, with noticeable instructive aims beyond simply telling us what happened. More on that later. The strict system of laws was a large part of the reason for Qin's success. Sima Qian attributes it more to their state's natural defenses, but I'm not so sure, though that did surely play some hand. Years pass, dukes come and go, states become allies with Qin, then betray it. Hostages are exchanged, battles are fought, sometimes in spite of the hostages. Cities are besieged or traded between states. Towns are destroyed or their residents forced to move to make way for colonists from their conquerors. A powerful family revolts. Such were the ordinary political affairs of this uncertain period. In Duke Huan's 24th year, Duke Li became ruler of Jin. He concluded an alliance with Duke Huan of Qin, the two states occupying opposite sides of the Yellow River, but once the Qin ruler had returned to his capital, he violated the alliance and joined with the Di people in plotting and carrying out a surprise attack on Jin. It's this kind of passage over and over again with some variation. To you and I, these are boring paragraphs. To the people they concern, they were their whole lives. The overall pattern is that Qin annexes more and more land. This has traditionally been likened to a gradual eating away of the other states in the fashion that a silkworm eats mulberry. One or two dukes try to emulate the ways of Duke Mu, with mixed success. There's also this one kind of funny remark about how Qin is immoral, so they'll never take over more land. It's kind of odd to see this sort of humor in a history. In the year of 323 BCE, Duke Hui Wen assumed the title of king. This was a big deal for Qin, as this meant they no longer nominally acknowledged fealty to the Zhou dynasty. Wei and Han beat Qin to the punch by 4 years. Watson indicates that commentators say there's a textual error here, and actually Qin and Han were the first to declare their ruler a king, rather than Wei and Han. In 288, King Zhaosheng actually declared himself emperor, but the king of Qi also called himself emperor? Since there could only be one son of heaven, they both went back to being kings within the year. Shows how utterly human the titles are, though supposedly the son of heaven was chosen by heaven. Kinda reminds me of that time there were 3 popes in the 14th century. Most of the biographies in the final section of records of the grand historian Qin dynasty occur around the reign of King Zhaosheng and his grandson, King Zhuangsheng. The contents of the basic annals of the first emperor of the Qin are detailed enough to be biographies themselves, though. From here on, I'll be telling you about events described in both. King Zhaosheng's reign is when the story really starts picking up, so to speak. A notable figure we meet at this point is Lu Buwei. Like a lot of these people, he's still a pretty popular figure, the subject of novels, movies, that kind of thing. According to Wikipedia, there was a 2001 TV series about a time-traveling cop that prominently featured Lu Buwei as an antagonist. Originally, Lu Buwei was a powerful merchant from Wei. Remember the Wei from earlier where Lord Sheng was born? This is the other Wei. The Confucians traditionally, and not without reason, regarded the pursuit of profit as unethical and dangerous. Given that he's a merchant, from later Confucian perspectives, this is already a big strike against him. Lu Buwei wanted to move up in the world. With his wealth and influence, he became friends with Zichu, a grandson of King Zhaosheng of Qin, living as a hostage in Zhao. Zichu's father, the crown prince, neglected him, since Zichu was born to Lady Xia, who was not Zichu's primary wife. Zhao didn't show him any respect either, since Qin attacked Zhao a few times even with him there. Lu Buwei gave Zichu 500 measures of gold so he could gain some followers and status. Money ruled the world back then, too. The crown prince's primary consort was Lady Huayang, but she'd borne him no heirs. To get nearer, Lu Buwei brought her, quote, various rare objects, trinkets, and toys. Sima Qian tells us, he took the opportunity to mention how virtuous and wise Zichu was, how he had friends among all the followers of the various feudal lords all over the world, how he was constantly heard to exclaim, "Her ladyship is as precious as heaven itself to me," and how he wept day and night with longing for his father, the crown prince, and Lady Huayang. Laying it on a bit thick, don't you think? He kept this up a while. Apparently, this convinced Lady Huayang, though, since she decided to take Zichu as her own son. The crown prince, Lord Angguo, unofficially agreed to make Zichu his heir. One pretty interesting story is that of a man named Fanju. Of course he's a man, what with the wanton institutional sexism. Fanju, like so many before him, was a native of Wei. Since he was poor, he couldn't directly seek office, Instead, he worked for the official Shu Jia. On a mission to the state of Qi, the king of Qi sent Fan Zhu some beef and wine because of his reputation for eloquence. Although Fan Zhu refused the gift, Shu Jia suspected that Fan Zhu was actually turning state secrets over to Qi. Word of this reached Wei Qi, the prime minister of Wei. He'd live to regret it, but apparently without any evidence, he sent some goons after Fan Zhu. As Sima Qian says, Fan Zhu, his ribs broken and teeth knocked out, pretended to be dead, whereupon he was wrapped in a reed mat and dumped into the privy. There the guests who were drinking with the prime minister at the time, drunk, took turns pissing on him. That is some shocking brutality. I was pretty surprised that Watson used the word pissing instead of urinating. I don't remember any other foul language in this book, but I've noticed that the standard for translations of ancient literature these days seems to be the use of the more vulgar terms for bodily functions. I'm not complaining, just observing. Wei Qi, drunk, ended up letting the guard take Fan Zhu away. Pretty soon, Fan Zhu assumed the name Zhang Lu and went into hiding with help from a man named Zheng Anping. Through some subtle maneuvering with a visitor from King Zhaoshang's court, Zheng Anping arranged for Fan Zhu to be brought into Qin with the Qin official Wang Ji. At this point, a powerful figure in Qin was Wei Ran, the Marquis of Rang, King Zhaoshang's uncle, and as of 294, prime minister. Actually, he'd later almost conquer Wei. Fan Zhu's ex-patron Shu Jia talked the Marquis of Rang into leaving for strategic reasons. Like most of the arguments in the book, he cites a bunch of historical precedents. To be clear about this, the Marquis of Rang had his troops literally surrounding the Wei capital, and he was convinced to leave through rhetoric. Now that's persuasion. The Marquis of Rang was hostile to letting foreigners into Qin, and wouldn't you know it, he personally happened to stop Wang Ji's carriage for a chat. The Marquis of Rang forgot to have his soldiers search the carriage, though, but Fan Zhu thought he would realize his mistake. And he did. A soldier turned up later on horseback to search the carriage, but Fan Zhu had left to hide. It must have been terrifying for Fan Zhu, but, as this sort of thing happens surprisingly often in history, it was a petty accident that resulted in him getting into Qin. Months passed without King Zhaoshang bothering to seek an audience with Fan Zhu. I guess getting worried, Fan Zhu wrote the king an eloquent letter about how wise rulers sometimes overlooked good people. After this, the king granted Fan Zhu an audience, but Fan Zhu pretended not to understand that he was the king. Fan Zhu told the king, "Qin has a king. I thought Qin just had the Queen Dowager and the Marquis of Rang." Blatantly insulting the ruler? That takes guts. But hey, it got King Zhaoshang's attention. Not that this was mockery, it is meant to be instructive. Fan Zhu warned him that the Marquis of Rang was gaining too much power. He was the prime minister, the military leader, his sister was the Queen Dowager, and King Zhaoshang was only on the throne because the Marquis of Rang chose him over his brothers. Fan Zhu also criticized the Marquis of Rang for keeping lackluster officials in office and pursuing a bad strategy with his plan to attack an enemy state. You know, he was going to send troops through multiple states first, and it just didn't work. The king was deeply impressed with Fan Zhu. Soon the Marquis of Rang was forced into retirement. Later, he died on his fief. That's a pretty mild ending for him. Most of the Qin officials are disgraced and kill themselves or get chopped apart or something like that. Well, not really, but the ones who Sima Qian emphasizes. With Fan Zhu's guidance, King Zhaoshang scored many more victories for Qin. This was the beginning of the end for the other feudal states. In 266, Fan Zhu was given a fief and made the Marquis of Ying. Later on, King Zhaoshang sent Wang Yi to lay siege to a city in Zhao. Things went really badly. At this point, Zichu and Lu Buwei were living in Zhao as hostages. Since Qin was attacking anyway, the incensed soldiers wanted to kill them. But Lu Buwei and Zichu, on another of their adventures, were able to bribe their way past the guards and escape. Money is king. Apparently, Zichu's wife and son escaped separately, also with bribes. This is important, since Zichu's son is the first emperor. Remember Shu Jia? When Qin was going to invade Wei again, he was sent to negotiate with them. If he persuaded the Marquis of Rung not to attack the capital after surrounding it with troops, then I understand why they would trust this guy to convince Qin. Fan Zhu decided to put on some tattered poor people clothes to visit Shu Jia. "Fan Zhu, are you alive and well?" "I am," said Fan Zhu. "And what are you doing now?" asked Shu Jia. "I am working as a hired man for someone." "How hard up you look, Fan Zhu," he said, and taking one of his robes of coarse silk, he gave it to Fan Zhu as a present. The next day, Shu Jia went to visit the Prime Minister. When he recognized that Fan Zhu was the Prime Minister, can you imagine his shock? He fell to his knees and begged for forgiveness for wrongfully reporting him to Wei Qi. Fan Zhu said, "How many are your crimes?" "Though I plucked out the hairs of my beard to tally them all, they would not suffice." "No," said Fan Zhu, "your crimes are only 3. Fan Zhu spared Shu Jia because when he visited him, Shu Jia was willing to help him, giving him food and a silk robe. As for Wei Qi, Fan Zhu wasn't so sympathetic. He demanded his head. As for Zheng Anping, he was called in from Wei to become a general for Qin. According to Sima Qian, Fan Zhu used his private wealth to repay all those who had helped him when he was starving and in distress. Persons who aided him with no more than a single meal invariably received their reward, but those who had so much as glared at him angrily were likewise paid back in full. There is no moral judgment passed on Fan Zhu in that paragraph, but this sounds terrifying. The description calls to mind Madame Defarge, a person faced with grave injustice who later, given the chance to get back at those who wronged her, becomes a monster herself. I understand this is hyperbolic, but really? So much as glared at him angrily? Gosh, I mean, is this the story of a supervillain or mass murderer? Well, kind of. Just not Fan Zhu. This is still pretty amazing, though, to see Fan Zhu go from some poor guy accused of treason, being beat up and literally pissed on, to being a powerful official in a state. Wei Qi escaped Fan Zhu, though, going into hiding with the former Prime Minister of Zhao. In 264, a man named Cai Ze from the state of Yan turned up in Qin. The opening of his biography reads like the beginning of a movie. He goes to a fortune teller to hear his fortune, and the fortune teller jokes how he's ugly, and they say sages are ugly, but Cai Ze only wants to know how long he live, and he's told he has 43 more years. Later, Cai Ze said to his carriage driver, "Plenty of grain, fat meat to chew on, dashing around with fast horses, seals of yellow gold in my robe, purple cords of office tied in my waist, bowing before the ruler. If I can eat meat and enjoy that kind of wealth and honor, then 43 years'll be enough." After wandering around for a while, probably a few years, Cai Ze convinced Fan Zhu to retire as prime minister. His argument, using examples like Lord Sheng, was that men who remained in office too long invariably came to bad ends. Fan Zhu retired and recommended Cai Ze replace him, and so Cai Ze did. Sima Qian praises Fan Zhu and Cai Ze as men of superlative eloquence. But he adds, there is also an element of luck in such situations. There are many men who were as worthy as these two, but who never had an opportunity of fully expounding their ideas. Too many, in fact, to finish describing. Some things never change. Nevertheless, if these two men had not met with adversity, they might never have been inspired to such efforts. Sima Qian would know about adversity, but we'll hear more about that later.
Yo! Two! Face up!
Something interesting occurred in the year 258. Actually, I wonder if there might not be a mistake in the text. Well, of course there are, but I mean this particular one. In the biographies of Ban Qi and Wang Jian, King Zhaoshang is stated to have sent a Wang Ling to attack Handan, the capital of Zhao, in 258. Though Qin initially had military success, presumably cutting off hundreds of enemy heads, fortunes turned. In the biography of Lu Bu-wei, King Zhaoshang is stated to have sent a Wang Yi to attack Han Dan in 257. I think these passages are actually describing different phases of the same campaign. Qin's ill-fated campaign in Zhao lasted at least a year, and Wang Ling is said to have been replaced with a Wang Ha. It isn't far-fetched to imagine that the king later sent in another guy named Wang to replace Wang Ha, so I'm assuming this is the same campaign. In any case, in 258, Wang Ling lost, quote, 5 companies of men, however many that is, so King Zhaoshang asked the respected general Ban Qi to take his place. As it turns out, Ban Qi was one of the greatest generals of his era. But he refused on the grounds that the battle was impossible. Han Dan was too well fortified, and other states were rallying to send in more troops to support Zhao. The king in Fanzhou repeatedly asked Ban Qi to assume command, but he refused on the grounds of his illness. By the end of the year, Qin was badly losing. Ban Qi publicly stated that this is what the army got for not listening to him when he said they couldn't win. This outraged King Zhaoshang, who had Ban Qi reduced to a common soldier and exiled. Later on, since Ban Qi remained bitter and defiant, King Zhaoshang sent him a sword so he could commit suicide. Sima Qian describes what happened. As Bai Qi drew the sword and prepared to cut his throat, he said, "What crime have I committed against heaven that I should come to this?" Then after some time he said, "In fact, I deserve to die. In the Battle of Chengping, when several 100,000 soldiers of Zhao surrendered to me, I tricked them and had them buried alive. That is cause enough why I should die." Then he committed suicide. Burying people alive. That's about as savagely cruel as you can get. It's interesting hearing about the supposed regret of this general for a past crime. He seems to accept the whole situation very stoically. Could someone really accept their death this calmly, though? At least the public forgave Bai Qi, as the towns of Qin offered sacrifices to him after his suicide. Incidentally, this battle in Zhao is the same one in which the Zhao soldiers almost killed Zichu and Lu Bu-wei. In 256, the Zhou king formed an alliance with the other feudal kings to attack Qin. They lost. The Zhou dynasty, which had stood for 800 years, had fallen. The stage was set for heaven to choose a new son. 250 was a major year for Qin. The rulers of the other states visited King Zhaoshang as guests. If that isn't an indication of Qin's dominance at this point, what is? Then King Zhaoshang croaked. Normally the rulers of Qin had a much faster turnover rate than his impressive 75 years. People have always lived to an old age, just not most people. Lord Angguo ascended the throne and became King Xiao Wen. Then he died. 3 days. 3-day reign. That's gotta be some kind of record. Finally, in 250, Zichu rose to the throne and became King Zhuangsheng. Lu Bu-wei became prime minister. Under the reign of King Zhuangsheng, Qin came close to completely conquering China, or, as King Zhuangsheng would have thought, the whole world. In keeping with the trends throughout the states, Lu Bu-wei decided to compile a book and gain some intellectual followers. This is how I originally heard of Lu Bu-wei. In English, the book is known as The Annals of Lu Bu-wei, though I've also seen it under the title of Mr. Lu's Annals. The original title literally means something like The Spring and Autumn of Mr. Lu. The book is a remarkable encyclopedia. No text as thorough or organized from the period remains. For this reason, it is an invaluable document. Lu Bu-wei put the book in a public market, I think the public market of the Qin capital, and offered 1,000 gold to any scholar who could add or subtract a single character. That's confidence. Or maybe not, since Lu Bu-wei was one of the wealthiest men in China at the time. The book actually has been fully translated into English, available on Amazon now for a smooth and easy $70. In 247, a prince from Wei, Qin's primary rival, banded together with the forces of the other feudal states for a last stand against Qin. They succeeded, driving the general Meng Ao and his troops across the Yellow River. Not for long. This was the final big push against Qin. Shortly afterwards, King Zhuangsheng died, and King Zheng ascended to the throne, though the state remained under Lu Buwei's control since the sovereign was so young. We have finally reached the basic annals of the first emperor of the Qin. Yeah, all this stuff up till now, that was preliminary. The entire span of events covered in the rest of the book is summarized in 2 paragraphs at the end of the basic annals of Qin. Only 2. Imagine if we could be this in-depth with every single ruler, or every single of the hundreds of thousands of lives that were occurring at the same time as these events of historic importance. Although the name Shi Huangdi that the first emperor coined for himself is translated as, well, first emperor, the first emperor was born with the rather less impressive name Zhao Zheng. The first emperor's father was King Zhuangsheng, and his mother an unidentified concubine of the prime minister Lu Buwei. I saw once a theory that the first emperor was actually Lu Buwei's son, not King Zhuangsheng's. The biography of Lu Buwei mentions the old merchant had been fooling around with a dancing girl he had met in Zhao, and pretty soon she was pregnant. Then, while they were drinking one night, Zichu asked him if he could marry her, not realizing she was pregnant. Lu Buwei was infuriated, but decided to let Zichu have this woman, since, after all, he had invested his fortune in the boy. When the woman gave birth, the son was named Zheng. What I like is that Sima-chan doesn't call attention to this. Everywhere else, he says that the first emperor is the son of an unidentified concubine and King Zhuangsheng. You know, as an infant, he and everyone else around him were unaware of his destiny, or of what his life would become. But was he so bad? We'll get to that. Everybody has the potential to do good when they're born. Certainly Mengzi would agree, writing as he did that humans naturally contain a sprout of benevolence that needs to be nourished and exercised, lest it atrophy away. Mengzi was dead by the first emperor's day, but the first emperor did not share this perspective. As a baby, though, he was presumably just thinking about baby stuff, not conquering the world on his ancestors' behalf. Sima-chan offers no opinion on the matter. King Zheng's predecessors did a lot of the work, but he and his generals like Wang Jian, Li Xin, and Meng Ao took the final steps towards the elimination of the other feudal states. The specific military details don't interest me too much, so I won't mention them here. A lot of the details aren't really mentioned in the basic annals of the first emperor anyway. I think instead they're mostly in the basic annals of the other feudal states. Suffice to say that there was an immense amount of violence, and countless thousands of lives were destroyed. Okay, I have to talk about Lao Ai. Lu Buwei, after all these years, was still having an affair with King Zheng's mother. But he was worried that sooner or later, the details of the affair would come out and he'd be implicated in the scandal. So, he decided he had to do something about this. What he did was, he had his agents find a guy named Lao Ai who had a particularly large penis. I kinda have to wonder how his agents went about searching for Lao Ai. Did they just walk around the streets asking people, hey, who around here has a really big dick? Or was it more like they knew there was this sort of braggart named Lao Ai who said he had a big penis, and so they said, oh yeah, let's take his word on that? Or did they say they were gonna pay people, someone if they would come and let them take a look at their penis? Or I don't really know. And whatever thing they did, they had to do it kind of discreetly, or word of it might end up reaching the king somehow. Oh, in any case, they found Lao Ai, and they came up with this whole scheme about how he would be at a party, and they played what is described as suggestive music, and he walks around with his penis put through like a wheel or something, and the Queen Mother hears about him, and the Queen Mother, had him summoned to meet her, and I suppose she was just that interested in the idea of this guy with a huge penis. And so anyway, after this, the next part of their scheme, they made up a crime for Lao Ai to be charged with, and then made a show of him being castrated. Now, he wasn't really castrated, but they made him officially a eunuch, so that he would be allowed to serve the Queen Mother. And with her, he ended up having an affair for years, and secretly fathered 2 sons. He also ended up being made a marquis. Now, throughout history, you hear all sorts of unexpected reasons that people come to power, but a person becoming a marquis and having sons with the king's mother for no virtue of his own other than having a big dick? I've never heard anything else like that. In any case, we're going to get back to Lao Ai in a bit here. It won't all be so funny. In 238 BCE, when Qin was in the midst of conquering Wei, King Zheng apparently received the cap of manhood. I assume that refers to a coming-of-age ceremony. More importantly, now that he had received the cap of manhood, he began governing the country himself, rather than leaving it to Lu Bu Wei. Also, quite importantly, this was the year Lao Ai attempted a coup. A report reached King Zheng that Lao Ai wasn't actually a eunuch. King Zheng learned about the 2 secret sons, and according to this report, Lao Ai and the Queen Mother plotted for one of them to be the next king. The situation reached its most violent extreme. Lao Ai forged the seals of the Queen Mother and rallied dissatisfied palace guards and chiefs from among the Rong and Di peoples to overthrow King Zheng. King Zheng was in Yung for the 4th month. Lao Ai's plot was to attack him while he was still there instead of at the Qin capital, Xianyang. Instead, loyal troops fought with Lao Ai at the capital, beheading a few hundred people until Lao Ai himself was caught. The 2 illegitimate sons were killed. Lao Ai was torn apart by carriages, his family was exterminated, and the rebellion completely wiped out. Talk about merciless. This would be a pattern for Zhao Zheng. The story of Lao Ai didn't stay funny, huh? Lu Bu Wei was implicated in the Lao Ai affair, but because of his years of service and his immense number of powerful followers, he was forced into retirement instead of being executed. But in 235, amid mounting suspicion, he began fearing the death penalty. At risk of his parents, children, wife, and brothers being put to death, he drank poison and was secretly buried. Thus ended the career of an illustrious man. In China, among the Confucians, Lu Bu Wei was usually remembered as an irresponsible, contemptible man who vastly overstepped the authority of his vile merchant class to influence politics. In the West, we'd probably consider him a largely admirable merchant prince type. Lu Bu Wei was a patron of many scholars. Remember Mr. Lu's Annals? Consider the Lao Ai affair. Can you imagine how the king's mother must have felt seeing her first son murder her other sons? Or how King Zheng felt learning his mother had plotted against him in this way? No wonder the king wasn't exactly mentally stable. The Queen Mother was exiled from the capital for a few years, but she was later invited back. She died in 228. The next few years also marked the rise to prominence of a man named Li Si. A student of the Confucian philosopher Xun Zi, Li Si was a retainer of Lu Bu Wei. He actually gave the king the idea of uniting the other states, or at least was one of many voices telling him to do so. This is an opportunity that comes once in 10,000 ages. If one is lazy and fails to act quickly, the feudal lords will recover their strength and join in an alliance against Qin. And then, though one be as worthy as the Yellow Emperor, he could never unite them. Lisa was actually a commoner who ended up entering into the service of Lu Bu Wei. He actually, unlike most of Lu Buwei's followers, was not implicated in the Lao Ai affair and was able to carry on a quite illustrious career. But we'll get to more on that later. At about this time, a man from Han came to Qin with the mission of convincing the government to build a canal. The idea was that this would divert men and resources from the war, but when the plot was discovered, the officials told the king to exile all foreign officials from the state. Li Se, as a native of Chu, wrote the king a letter pleading that he not deport all foreigners. The whole letter is included in the biography of Li Se. Interestingly, his biography is full of entire letters, and none of the others are. The argument's pretty interesting. Basically, foreign food, foreign music, foreign precious stones and gold and clothing and women, etc. are all positive contributions to Qin, and men should be no different. However, they're treated as different. Moreover, the intelligent and useful people Qin would banish would just end up helping the other states instead. In our own time period, an argument about the value of foreigners seems somehow relevant. This time period before the annihilation of the other states gives us one of the famous stories I first heard so many years ago, Jing Ke's failed attempt to assassinate the first emperor. This is actually passed over only briefly in the basic annals of the first emperor, but is given a thorough treatment in Chapter 86, the biographies of the assassin retainers. Jing Ke is the only one of these assassin retainers with anything to do with Qin. There have been some movies about it, actually. One of them, Hero, directed by Zhang Yimou, features Jet Li in the role of the nameless assassin, not Jing Ke. It's one of those magical martial art wuxia films, focused on spectacle and high production values. Some great cinematography, very strong color motifs. Another is Chen Kaige's older film, The Emperor and the Assassin, starring Zhang Fengyi as Jing Ke and Li Shuijian as King Zheng. The film also stars Gong Li in the role of Lady Zhao. Note that in this film, King Zheng is not called Zhao Zheng, but Ying Zheng. This is a totally legit alternate version of his personal name. This film is much more grounded and realistic than Hero, even if it puts an odd spin on the story of Jing Ke. Ying Zheng is shown as a complex figure. But although he wants peace and stability, much of the story is his increasingly brutal violence and the corruption of his ideals. The film also covers Lao Ai's attempted coup. Like Ying Zheng, he comes across as both noble, kind of, and villainous. Though it's hard to be more villainous than Ying Zheng. The actor playing Lao Ai looks appropriately slimy and untrustworthy. Interestingly, Lao Ai even gives a damning speech to the king after his arrest, revealing to him that his father is Lu Buwei, not the previous king. This leads to a great sequence, maybe the best in the movie, in which Ying Zheng confronts Lu Buwei about his parentage. Another official who appears throughout the film is an almost evilly single-minded demon, reminding Ying Zheng to blindly obey the laws and his ancestors' wishes to rule the world. He tells the king to execute Lu Buwei. The king begs him to not insist, to give him mercy, until finally, for the good of the state, Lu Buwei hangs himself. Ying Zheng weeps, hugs his father's corpse, and then emerges a changed man. It is from here that the film portrays the king betraying his ideals and descending into isolation and increasingly brutal violence. In real life, at least as far as anything there is to be found in the records of the Grand Historian, there is no reason to think that the first emperor ever suspected his father wasn't the previous king. But in real life, his father really might have been King Zhuangxiang. We'll get to that. Seeing the horrible violence in records of the Grand Historian actually portrayed on screen rather than glossed over in text, it really hammers home how brutal and horrific this war was. Even if they actually invented new crimes against humanity for the king of Qin, as far as I know, nobody else ever accused him of burying dozens or hundreds of children alive. As far as I know, Lady Zhao's completely fictional. The portrayal of Jing Ke is so wildly different from the historical figure that it feels kind of disingenuous. This is artistic liberty, but I still don't like it. At least Jinka's in the movie at all. The assassins in Hero are pure fancy. Although, then again, that film is basically a fantasy film. But what does Sima-chan tell us about Jinka? By about 230, Qin was marching on Han, Wei, Zhao, and the other states. It was inevitable that the Qin troops would reach An before long. An was one of the weaker states, not able to fully secure its borders. Dan, the crown prince of An, was rightfully very worried about what would happen when King Zheng set sights on his kingdom. When they were young, Prince Dan had actually been friends with Zhao Zheng. They grew up together as hostages in Zhao, and later Prince Dan was a hostage in Qin. But evidently the two had a falling out, or perhaps simply years of cruel indifference. In any case, Prince Dan presumably knew King Zheng well enough to know that war was inevitable. Sima-chan doesn't go into that much detail about any of this, but interpersonal relationships are a major part of what really intrigues me about history. Prince Dan asked his tutor for a solution. His tutor pointed him to a reputable man named Master Tian, with whom he arranged a secret meeting. While it might be funny if Prince Dan followed a long chain of recommendations, Master Jing was Jinka. Turns out Jinka was a laid-back intellectual type from Wei. Lu Buwei's way, not Sheng Yang's way. He practiced swordsmanship, read books, and traveled from state to state. As Sima-chan says, although Jinka spent his time with drunkards, he was a man of depth and learning. Whatever feudal state he traveled to, he always became close friends with the most worthy and influential men. When he was living in Yan around 227, Jinka became friends with a musician named Gao Jianli. Watson says Gao Jianli played the lute, so I assume that means he played the pipa, like our contemporary Wu Man, the world's foremost pipa virtuoso. Already Jinka is much more interesting than the version of him in The Emperor and the Assassin. There, he used to be a ruthless assassin. Now he has given up violence, but after Lady Zhao saves him from execution, he becomes friends with her and is eventually roused to action for one last job to take out the King of Qin. The real guy was a bookish amateur swordsman who went around drinking and singing songs all day. He and Gao Jianli would wander the streets, singing up tunes and openly weeping over the emotion they moved them to. This is not the guy you'd expect to be an assassin. For this guy to accept the job, to face such a dangerous mission that could perhaps go against his greater morals and end in suicide. Now, there is a great story. Why isn't there a better movie about Jinka? Maybe there is. It's not like I've exhaustively searched every Chinese film ever made. I only have one lifetime, you know. Tian Guang went to tell Jinka about the prince's request. They say, Tian Guang continued, that a worthy man does not act in such a way as to arouse distrust in others. Now the prince has warned me that the matter we discussed is of vital concern to the nation and begged me not to let word of it leak out. Obviously he distrusts me, and if my actions have aroused his distrust, then I am no gentleman of honor. Tian Guang had decided to commit suicide in order to spur Jinka to action, and he continued, I want you to go at once and visit the prince. Tell him I am already dead, so he will know that I have not betrayed the secret. With this, he cut his throat and died. That's pretty hardcore. Did people really kill themselves over such seemingly trivial matters? Could be. It's always amazing what people are capable of. I suppose it would guilt you into carrying out his request. I literally killed myself for you, so you'd better not let me down. So Jinka met with the crown prince, who outlined his idea. To find a really brave man who would be willing to go as our envoy to the court of Qin and tempt it with some offer of gain. The king of Qin is greedy, and under the circumstances would surely listen to our offer. If this man could then somehow threaten the king and force him to return to the feudal lords all the land he has seized, that would be the best we could ask for. And if that proved impossible, he might still be able to stab and kill the king. Initially, Jinka declined to take the mission, but Prince Dan basically groveled until he consented. But the troops of Qin got closer and closer without Jinka taking any action. Prince Dan gave him carriages, serving girls, and other gifts to persuade him to hurry up, but that probably gave Jinka more incentive to stay. Why go on a suicide mission when he could drink and enjoy music in the company of his friends and the pretty ladies in An? With Wang Jian marshalling troops by An's borders, Jinka finally took the mission. First he went to Fan Uchi, a Qin general who abandoned his sovereign and was hiding out in An. Jinka convinced him to kill himself. Qin had slaughtered his family, and with his head as a gift for the king of Qin, Jinka might be able to get close enough to kill him. Fan Yuqi had been desperate to find some way he could avenge his family and end his suffering, and now he had both in one. Next, Prince Dan, still mourning Fan Yuqi's death, got the sharpest dagger that he could be found and coated the blade with poison. Though the thrust drew hardly enough blood to stain the robe of the victim, every one of the men dropped dead on the spot. The text doesn't clarify who the test subjects were. I assume they're probably criminals facing the death penalty. Jinka kept delaying, then finally he left with Gao Jianli and some other guys. The prince saw them off, and they marched down the road as Gao Jianli plucked a mournful tune, and the whole party wept. They knew they were doomed. Sure enough, King Zheng was very happy to receive Fan Yuqi's head and a promise for a region of An to be given to Qin. Once Jinka and his partners got close, King Zheng began unrolling the map of this region he'd been gifted. When the dagger appeared, Jinka grabbed the king's arm, seized the dagger, but didn't stab him. Afterwards was what so many real-life fights really are, nothing glamorous but embarrassing confusion. Jinka and the king hopped around a pillar, one trying to get a clear shot and the other to avoid it. King Zheng's sword was stuck in the scabbard, the courtiers were milling about in disorder, and oh yeah, the guards weren't allowed in when court was in session. Having nothing with which to strike at Jinka, the king, in panic-stricken confusion, merely flailed at him with his hands. At the same time, the physician Xia Wuju, who was in attendance, battered Jinka with the medicine bag he was carrying. You get the picture. They say that comedy is tragedy plus time, but can you imagine how terrifying this must have been for the people involved? Finally, the king managed to draw his sword and wounded Jinka. Laughing, the would-be assassin attributed his failure to his desire not to kill the king, but to threaten him. As you can imagine, this was it for the state of An. The next year, An was no more, and there was a widespread hunt for any associates of Jinka or Prince Dan. Prince Dan himself was beheaded by the Qin general Wang Jian. 5 years later, in 221, King Zhan of Qi was captured. Thus the process Zhao Zheng's ancestors began was brought to its logical conclusion. Qin had conquered the last of the warring states. After so many centuries, the Middle Kingdom was unified. At this point, there must have been a what now kind of attitude. King Zheng told his Chancellor Wang Wan, Secretary Feng Jie, and the Commandant of Justice Li Si that since he'd overcome the evil schemes of the other 6 dangerous kings and brought profound order to the world, the next step was to adopt a new title. King wouldn't cut it anymore. It is true that the other kings plotted against him in various ways, not that this should exactly be surprising. They could have said the same about King Zheng, characterizing him as greedy and scheming and unruly, using his troops to bring disorder to the world. Naturally, Zhao Zheng wasn't the type to consider this alternate perspective. You may be able to guess what new title his advisors suggested. That's right, the term translated as emperor, Shi Huang. It combines the titles of several of the legendary ancient rulers of China, that is, the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, whom the Confucians regarded as models of virtue. These people are mythical culture heroes, like Prometheus. They invented agriculture, gave humans fire, and ruled the world with sagely benevolence, that kind of thing. The first emperor is hardly alone in history for taking such a step, but for anyone to arrogate the titles of major culture heroes strikes me as wildly overstepping the bounds of decency. So yeah, he wasn't really the first emperor, but rather the first emperor of the Chinese cultural sphere that was unified rather than a series of separate kingdoms. The Qin dynasty, he proclaimed, would last 10,000 generations. It lasted for 20 years, so about one generation. This belief that his state would last eternally is an early sign of the first emperor's fixation on immortality. The first emperor also hated criticism. He abolished the practice of posthumous names on the grounds that the next generation had no right to judge the former. I hope that everyone who sees this video agrees that this is absolutely the opposite of how the world should work and does work. This part might be kind of boring since it's about administrative division, but this is major. The first emperor wanted to centralize state power. He learned from the mistakes of the past. Lisa told him that in the Zhou dynasty, the kings gave fiefs to their families until eventually the land was divided into a patchwork of fiefs that began consuming each other until there were the warring states. Therefore, instead of rewarding his relatives and officials with grants of land, the first emperor would reward them with grants of money. That's a much more open use of taxpayer money than the embezzling and bribes contemporary politicians prefer. The empire was divided into provinces and districts with a clear hierarchy of administration, a civil and military administrator for each province, and an emperor for the central government. Of course, Sima-chan doesn't use it in terms of centralizing state power or central government, since political science wasn't a highly developed field in the Han Dynasty. But politics itself was developed. These concepts clearly existed, even if there weren't terms for them. With quite a few modifications, this provincial system remains the standard in China today, 2,200 years later. The borders were secured, garrisoned with convicts. Meng Tian drove the Xiongnu barbarians north and constructed what would become the Great Wall. The southern border touched Korea, and the northern the Yellow River. Additionally, the emperor had weapons confiscated from throughout the empire and melted down to create bells and some 29-ton statues. To carry on the theme of centralization, the various noble families from throughout the empire were forced to relocate to Shenyang, specifically 120,000 of them. Uprooting your life, moving everything you own to another city, is miserable, especially in those days. But this had the same purpose of centralizing power. Don't let some influential people exist out in the periphery. With the army right next door, they'll be much more inclined to obey the sovereign. The next few years saw another feat that is of immense importance. Under Li Si's guidance, the Qin standardized weights and measures throughout the empire. Now a pound in the east was the same as a pound in the west. Or a pickle is the same, whatever. From here on out, the stories are much more familiar to me. The burning of the books, the burying of the scholars, Shu Fu's hunt for the immortals, shooting at fish with a crossbow.
Yo! Two! It's up!
These are the stories I've heard over the years. From 220 to 215, the first emperor toured the empire, having various inscriptions carved into stone and metal extolling his virtue. On and on. Early rising, late to retire, he takes measures to bring lasting benefit, devoting himself earnestly to instruction and precept. His admonitions circulate, his proclamations spread abroad, so that near and far alike are properly ordered, and all bow to the will of the sage. Eminent and humble are clearly distinguished, men and women observant of ritual, cautious and attentive to their duties. Great righteousness. He demolished walls and fortifications, opened up waterways, cut through embankments, levied the steep declivities. When the shape of the land had been fixed, the masses were freed from corvée labor. Have the honor to the empire was comforted, so now men delight in their tasks. Back to the subject of immortality. A man named Shu Fu submitted a memorial to the first emperor, describing the islands of the immortals in the ocean, including the mythological Penglai. In exchange for money, ships, and several thousand young boys and girls, they would embark on an expedition to find these islands and come back with the secrets of immortality. Shu Fu wasn't the only person who stepped forward, offering to find the elixir of immortality. Han Zheng, Master Lu, and others did as well, receiving thousands of cash. This might sound like a swindle, but actually was very risky. A lot of them probably weren't con artists but sincerely practiced magic, but if the first emperor didn't see results, he would kill them. And remember that the death penalty meant the whole family would be exterminated. I'll get ahead of myself here. Shu Fu and his crew never found the Islands of the Immortals on their voyages. Or maybe they did, since eventually they never came back. Presumably they all died at sea, settled in Japan, or went into hiding somewhere knowing full well that if they returned without the elixir, the first emperor would kill them all. I'm surprised by some of the details that records of the Grand Historian Qin dynasty omits. Although, from what I've heard elsewhere, Shu Fu disappeared at sea, this is never mentioned in this book. Other details are never brought up either, including the first emperor consuming mercury, or the monumental feats like the Terracotta Army. Well, maybe that one's kind of alluded to. I wonder if these are in other historical records or in other parts of the Shiji. Probably both. Reading this, I can't help but wonder if either Shu Fu was the head of a cult, or else was conning the first emperor. Sima-chan seems to favor the conning perspective. Consider this sort of reckless, foolish decision-making to be foreshadowing. On top of everything else, the first emperor was a devoted bureaucrat, as befits the state of Qin. Supposedly, every night, he had the documents he'd approved weighed to be sure he'd signed a pickle's worth. He was probably going crazy. Isolation, supreme power, and extreme pressure can do that to a warlord. Meanwhile, some scholars continue to criticize the first emperor for his cruel laws, for example, or using the people for slave labor too much, or his failure to be polite and give his relatives fiefs. I'd think scholars could see why enfiefing his relatives would be a bad idea, but it just goes to show the fixation on precedent that ruled China. This leads us to the first emperor's most notorious crimes. In 213, Li Se wrote a letter to the emperor. Since scholars were allegedly using the variety of ideas expressed in literature to mislead the public by exposing them to ideas that didn't match the state's narrative and philosophy, all the books in the empire should be gathered and burned. The individual cannot be allowed to have his own ideas. Moreover, anyone who dared to use history or other schools of philosophy to criticize the first emperor would be put to death along with their family. Only, quote, academicians whose duty it is to possess the books will be allowed to keep them, whatever exactly that means. And they didn't ban knowledge outright. Books on medicine, divination, agriculture, and forestry were exempted. As far as I know, this is the first book burning in history. In the words of my father, whenever books are being burned, something has gone horribly wrong. This is a prime example of the first emperor's increasing paranoia over any notions that challenged his own. The whole incident was started because some officials tried to correct some of his bad behavior in exactly the way the Confucians would later encourage. The only reason a state would burn books is because those books contain arguments and ideas that the state cannot refute. Repressing free speech in this way is a sign of weakness, not of strength. But of course some silly liberal like me would say that. I'd be like an alien to ancient China. This loss of knowledge and of the historical records of the other feudal states was a devastating blow to Chinese scholars. To Sima-chan, the frustration would have been all too real. Because of the actions of some men some 100+ years ago, he lost historical sources to consult for his book, and this definitely contributed to his dislike of the Qin. But more on that later. Do you remember Jing Ke's friend Gao Jianli? He actually managed to escape arrest. It's not clear when this falls in the timeline, but Gao Jianli had gone into hiding as a workman for a wealthier family. Since he always gave his commentary on the musicians the family had over, Gao Jianli finally was compelled to play some music for them. He was a true artist. Couldn't stop talking about music even after all these years. So soon the family treated him as an equal. His reputation finally brought him to the attention of the first emperor, who invited Gao Jianli to perform for him in Shanyang. Obviously, he couldn't refuse. But when someone recognized Gao Jianli from the Jingke incident, the first emperor had him arrested. He was feeling merciful that day, so instead of having him torn apart by carriages, they settled for cutting out Gao Jianli's eyes instead. I can't even imagine. Can you imagine how painful that would be? His eyes! Cutting out your eyes! You can't imagine how painful something like that would be. Afterwards, Gao Jianli had to continue performing music for the first emperor, albeit blind. But he wanted to carry out that mission all those years ago that had killed so many people instead of killing Zhao Zheng. One day, Gao Jianli hid a chunk of lead inside his pipa. When the first emperor let him get close to play music for him, Gao Jianli swung the pipa at him, but instead of smashing the emperor's skull in, he missed. After that, Gao Jianli was executed, obviously. Followers of the former feudal lords were never allowed near the first emperor again. Pretty soon, nobody was. The first emperor is also remembered for his hugely ambitious construction projects. Like a pharaoh, his tomb at Mount Li was already under construction, perhaps ironic for a man so driven to live forever. Perhaps it just kept death on his mind constantly, so he didn't forget how much it scared him. Apparently more than 700,000 convicts and eunuchs were mobilized to build the tomb at Mount Li. In fact, they were mobilized to build Mount Li. It's a man-made mountain. Still there. Since Xianyang had grown so much, the royal palace, it needed to grow too, even though the first emperor already had 270 palaces. He ordered the construction of a new palace at Apeng, modeled after the supposed appearance of a palace in heaven. So they call it the Apeng Palace. It wasn't completed in his lifetime, but even then was already absolutely massive. I mean, this is a major undertaking of architecture and construction. Meanwhile, Master Lu hadn't found the immortals. He told the first emperor that the reason was evil spirits. Typical evil spirits, am I right? Afterwards, the first emperor decided that he needed to conceal himself from people to avoid the evil spirits. To this end, he had raised covered walkways constructed to connect his 270 palaces and towers, so that he could travel between them alone without anybody knowing his exact location, except for some of the eunuchs. Presumably, this ignorance of his location extended to the evil spirits. It was 212. Master Lu and some of the other magicians went into hiding, deciding that they couldn't possibly find the elixir of immortality quickly enough for the first emperor, who would surely execute them. Now enraged, an increasingly common mood for him, the first emperor undertook his other most notorious crime, and another of the stories I first heard years ago. He ordered Feng Jia to undertake an investigation of the academics in Xianyang, who were still hostile to the central government and, probably stealing money from him, he thought. Just like Master Lu, who ditched him after he'd paid him so much, and just because he was going to kill him and his family, probably. Sima Qian says, the scholars reported on one another in an attempt to exonerate themselves. Over 460 persons were convicted of violating the prohibitions and were executed in Xianyang, word of it being publicized throughout the empire so as to act as a warning to later ages. This is the burying of the scholars. The word that can mean execute in this case can also mean bury alive, and the later Confucian literati, eager to stress the evil of the first emperor, used this reading. Either way, at this point the situation had obviously become very bad. Human rights did not exist as a concept in ancient times, but even back then, the first emperor's acts were unjustifiable. The description of the scholars turning on each other reminds me of Stalinist Russia when the government turned citizens against each other to erode their bonds to their fellow people and replace these with bonds to the government. I don't know that Qin was doing that, but 212 is also the year that the first emperor exiled the Crown Prince Fu Su to work on the Great Wall with the general Meng Tian. The reason for this was that Fu Su dared to criticize his father, you see. At this point, there's also a story about an official who's traveling alone on a highway at night, and is stopped by a strange man holding a jade disc. And he hands him the jade disc, and he gives them this cryptic message that, later on can perhaps be interpreted as a prophecy that the first emperor is going to die. And like the jade disc, it is from a battle that Qin had many years ago, and maybe this guy is a mountain spirit or something. It's pretty surreal. It's like a scene out of Twin Peaks or something. By this point, the first emperor was well and truly out of his mind. Sima-chan never tells us that the first emperor went insane, but from the description of his random executions and the increasingly bizarre, paranoid, mystical beliefs he adopted, I think insanity is a justifiable analysis. Li Si's advice on not enfeefing officials was an excellent example of learning from the mistakes of the past. But as the few years of his reign went on, the first emperor committed many more errors that would become classic mistakes from which future generations would learn. Well, some of them. To avoid execution, Shufu explained that he reached Penglai, but giant fish attacked the fleet and kept them from the island. The first emperor had visions of a water god trying to kill him. Maybe the one who left the jade disc? Since the giant fish must be connected, he took a repeating crossbow and went on an expedition to the coast to kill these fish himself. Yes, this is what that I Got Two clip is supposed to represent.
Yo! Two!
On this trip, the first emperor fell ill. Forced to confront his mortality at last, the first emperor wrote a letter to Prince Fusu requesting that he return to Xianyang for the burial and presumably become the second emperor. The first emperor died in Langya. It was 210. So, is this the end of the book? No, not even close. What I never heard about except for a vague idea that it's really, really bad is the short reign of the second emperor. Though not nearly as short as the reign of King Xiaowen. The only people aware of the first emperor's death were Li Si, Prince Hu Hai, the chief of the office of palace carriages Zhao Gao, and 5 or 6 eunuchs. And yes, Sima-chan does say 5 or 6, so, about that many. At risk of attack or instability, they decided to keep the first emperor's death a secret until they got back to Xianyang. Keeping this secret allowed something else critical to occur. Let me tell you a little about Zhao Gao. He was a man descended from a family in Zhao who worked in some official capacity for Qin. The first emperor pardoned him from execution, resulting in his castration instead. Afterwards, he became an attendant of Prince Hu Hai, the emperor's youngest son. Since later on there's a reference to Zhao Gao's daughter, he presumably had at least one child before he was castrated. Zhao Gao, in serving Prince Hu Hai, seems to have been almost like a father figure for him. Do you remember General Meng Tian? His brother, Meng Yi, was the law official who refused to pardon Zhao Gao, leading to his castration. Suffice to say that Zhao Gao was not a forgiving man. I've never heard of Zhao Gao before. According to Burton Watson, quote, leaving aside a few stereotyped villains of high antiquity, such as the bad last rulers of the Xia and Shang dynasties, Zhao Gao is without doubt the most unmitigatedly evil figure to appear in the pages of the Shurji. There is something tragic about the first emperor, not so much Zhao Gao and Hu Hai. Hu Hai and Li Si were basically decent. Yes, Li Si was, even if he was responsible for the burning of the books. But Zhao Gao talked them into destroying that letter for Fusu, the letter that the first emperor on his deathbed wrote for his son. Instead, they forged a command that Hu Hai become the heir apparent, and Fusu and Meng Tian kill themselves. As Sima-chan portrays it, Zhao Gao convinces Li Si and Hu Hai that great men are decisive, that Hu Hai could never gain prominence with Fusu as emperor, that Fusu would force Li Si into retirement in favor of Meng Tian, that sages change with the times, etc. His lengthy speeches to Li Si and Hu Hai in the biography of Li Si reminds me of Iago from Othello. If you listen to my counsel, you can keep possession of your fief and title, and for generation after generation your heirs will call themselves Marquis. In longevity you will rival the immortal Prince Chao and Red Pine. In wisdom you will be like Confucius or Mo Tzu. But if you permit this occasion to slip away, then the disaster that will extend to your sons and grandsons is enough to make the heart turn cold." With tears in his eyes, Li Se decided that if he didn't betray the first emperor, then he would lose his land and title. The trip back to the capital was long and hot. To cover up the smell of the corpse, Li Se had carriages of fish brought along with them. Ew. Li Se, Hu Hai, and Zhao Gao sent a forgery to Prince Fu Su and Meng Tian, accusing them of disloyalty and failure against the Xiongnu people. "Fu Su has not acted as a filial son. I present him with a sword so he may settle the matter for himself." How heartless can they get? Though this kind of brutality is par for the course by now. Meng Tian was skeptical that the first emperor would really issue this command, but he couldn't persuade Fu Su, who committed suicide. Hu Hai was enthroned as Qin Shi, the second emperor. His reign isn't long enough to receive a separate chapter from his father. Meng Tian was in jail at this point for disobeying the forged letter, but Hu Hai wanted to pardon him. Zhao Gao would have none of that. Eager for revenge, he invented a story that the Meng family was plotting against him. Hu Hai offered to let Meng Yi kill himself rather than exterminate his whole family. Indignant, Meng Yi refused to kill himself. "Obedient service that ensures long life. This is what the Wei prizes. But punishing and killing, this is the end of the Wei. In past times, Duke Mu of Qin put to death 3 good ministers and accused Bai Li Shi of a crime worthy of execution, though the latter was guiltless. Therefore he was given the posthumous title Mu, or Mistaken. King Zhao Sheng of Qin put to death Bai Qi, Lord Wan. King Ping of Chu put to death Wu She, and King Fu Chai of Wu put to death Wu Zishu. These 4 rulers all committed grave errors, and the world condemned them for it. As rulers, they were thought to lack understanding, and the other feudal lords noted this in their records. Therefore it is said, one who governs by the way does not put to death the guiltless or inflict punishment on those without blame. I hope your lordship will give thought to the matter." Meng Yi was summarily executed, and Meng Tian soon drank poison and killed himself. Thus ended the illustrious career the Meng family had offered Qin for 3 generations. Meng Tian, like Bai Qi, wondered what he had done to warrant this fate, and decided his wrong was cutting through the earth's arteries and building roads in the Great Wall or something like that. Interestingly, Sima Qian states that explanation's nonsense and Meng Tian's real crime was hurting so many people through forcing them to labor on his construction projects. Hu Hai was a terrible ruler. First of all, remember the first emperor's tomb? The man-made Mount Li. It was full of treasures. The ceilings were painted with accurate maps of the night sky. It included a scale model map of the entire empire with flowing liquid mercury for the oceans and rivers. I've even heard, although this might not be true since it doesn't say it in this book, that there are jewels in the ceiling for representing the stars, accurately laying out the constellations. It was monumental, this tomb was. Also, the tomb was full of, I suppose, tripwires, such that crossbows were mounted to kill anyone who tried to go into it. Discourage grave robbing that way. And now that the first emperor was interred, Hu Hai, since he figured it only made sense, he decided to seal his father's whole harem in there with the corpse. And since the artisans who labored on the tomb might consider robbing it for the valuable materials they used in building it, Hu Hai sealed them in too. The text doesn't indicate that they were executed and then interred. No, they were sealed in there to die of thirst. The first emperor was an initially well-intentioned man who became increasingly dangerous and irrational. His son was a monster. I mean, I can barely think of a more horrible way to die. And think of how talented those artisans were, too. I mean, this was an impressive feat. These are the people who made the terracotta army. To reward them for their labors, they killed them. And they didn't just kill them, they killed them horribly. So next, the second emperor had all his brothers put to death. This isn't that uncommon in history, but that doesn't make it, like everything else realpolitik, less despicable. After touring the east with Li Se, adding to the inscriptions praising his father, it was time for Hu Hai to pursue his responsibilities as ruler. What was his policy? Mostly wasting a huge amount of money and labor on completing the Yepeng Palace. He also sent more troops to fight the tribes on the borders as his father had intended, but there wasn't enough food to feed them. As a result, the government ordered the provinces to send beans, millet, grass, and fodder to Xianyang, and farmers within 300 li of the city were taxed of all their grain. People were going hungry now, and faced with mounting taxes, garrison duty, and corvée labor. How was the second emperor spending his days? Mostly wrestling, listening to music, enjoying the good life. Where people are restless and angry and the head of state is weak, rebellion is inevitable. The troops in Jing revolted, a man named Chen She calling himself the King of Chu. The young men of the provinces and districts, having suffered under the Qin officials, all murdered the governors and commandants or the magistrates and aides of their respective provinces and districts, and declared themselves part of Chen She's revolt. But when an official told Hu Hai about the rebellion, the emperor promptly had him put to death for slander. Pretty soon, the officials in the capital were so scared of telling the emperor anything but what he wanted to hear that Hu Hai was pretty much totally cut off from what was actually happening in the world. Hu Hai trusted only Zhao Gao. Soon, Zhao Gao effectively controlled the government. He actively encouraged the second emperor not to listen to the other officials anymore on the grounds that they'd take advantage of him since he was younger. More rebels began sprouting up in the provinces, setting themselves up as kings of the states the first emperor overthrew, and one of them, Zhou Zheng, was getting dangerously close to the capital. For once, Hu Hai did something rational and mobilized convict laborers as troops to fight off Zhou Zheng. Though the capital was saved, the people remained eager to finish the job, and the ranks of gangs, robbers, and militias only swelled. Instead of confronting his own failures, Hu Hai blamed Li Se for letting this happen. Rather than risk death, Li Se abandoned his principles and sucked up to Hu Hai, writing him a letter about how virtuous rulers never listen to their ministers, or any criticism or any advice. Ironically, some of the other officials, including Li Se, were pleading with the second emperor to reduce the tax burdens on the peasants. In response, the second emperor gave a speech that basically endorses the opposite of every Confucian value. Or, I'm sorry, the values of common decency. I have a few opinions of my own. I have heard from Master Han that when Emperor Yao ruled the world, his halls were only 3 feet off the ground, the speckled beams were not planed, and the thatch of the roofs was left untrimmed. Even someone lodging in a humble inn was not as meanly housed as this. Winter days he wore a deerskin, summer days a robe of kudzu cloth. With coarse millet for food, a soup of greens, he ate his meal from an earthen pot and sipped from an earthen jar. Even the lot of a gatekeeper could not have been as cramped as this. Emperor Yu chiseled through Dragon Gate and opened up Da Xia, clearing courses for the 9 rivers, bordering them with 9 embankments and cutting a channel for the stagnant water so that it flowed to the sea. He worked till there was no more down on his thighs or hair on his shins, till his hands and feet were calloused and his face was burned black, and in the end he died far from the capital and was buried at Kuaiji. Even the toil of a slave taken prisoner in the wars could not have been more arduous than this. But if one has the honor of possessing the empire, he surely does not want to weary his body and strain his spirit by lodging like someone in a humble inn, eating the fare of a gatekeeper, and toiling with his hands like a slave taken in the wars. This is a task for a mere dullard to work at, certainly not the undertaking of a man of worth. When a man of worth possesses the empire, his sole concern is how to use the empire to gratify himself. This is why it is considered an honor to hold possession of the empire. A truly worthy ruler should be capable of bringing security to the empire and order to the 10,000 people. But now if I cannot even benefit myself, how can I hope to bring order to the empire at large? That is why I wish to indulge my whims, broaden my desires, enjoy for long the pleasures of the empire, and be free from harm. How shall I go about it?" Hu Hai preferred to leave the governing to the either extremely irresponsible or totally malicious Zhao Gao, while he laid around enjoying the luxuries his post in life offered. Can you imagine a more perfect picture of a bad monarch? Okay. To quell the public discontent, Zhao Gao proposed that the second emperor simply create even more laws and make the penalties more severe. As you might guess, this only made the situation worse. Those who squeezed the largest amount of taxes out of the people were deemed model officials. Men like this may truly be said to be supervising and reprimanding, the second emperor would say. Half of all the people passing along the roads had suffered punishment, and the bodies of the dead daily piled up in the marketplace. Li Si's continued ethical qualms were making him inconvenient to Zhao Gao, and so he invented a story about Li Si's son Li Yo conspiring with Chen Shi and the other robbers in Sanchuan. Finally standing up for his beliefs, Li Si submitted a memorial to the emperor explaining the many horrible things about Zhao Gao. Hu Hai was upset, but Li Si wouldn't budge. He has no understanding of principles, but is insatiable in his greed and never ceases his quest for gain. In rank and authority, he is second to the ruler, and his hopes and desires are boundless. Therefore I say he is dangerous. Zhao Gao claimed Li Si was smearing him as part of the plot to take over the empire that his son was apparently involved in. What else would Hu Hai do but believe him? Li Si was arrested, and Zhao Gao was put in charge of the investigation. Keep in mind that Li Si was one of Zhao Gao's co-conspirators. These were the guys who plotted to make Hu Hai the second emperor. The two actually had something else in common. They began life as poor commoners who rose to be powerful statesmen. The difference is that Li Si could actually do his job and wasn't a ruthless maniac. Zhao Gao tortured Li Si relentlessly, but even then, Li Si wouldn't do the respectable thing and commit suicide. He believed he could save himself by virtue of his past merits and his eloquence, and so he wrote another letter for the second emperor. Though Qin's land was not without breadth to begin with, I went on to drive out the Hu and Mo barbarians in the north, and to gain control of the 100 Yue tribes of the south, in that way displaying Qin's might. This was my second crime. I heaped honor on the chief ministers, showering them with titles and position, and in that way ensured their loyalty, which was my third crime. I set up altars of the soil and grain and repaired the ancestral temples, thus making clear the worth of the ruler. My fourth crime. I changed the regulations and made the weights and measures and ordinances uniform, promulgating them throughout the empire, and thus bringing fame to the Qin dynasty. My fifth crime. I constructed direct and fast roads and built pleasure parks and scenic towers, impressing on all the privileges of the ruler. My sixth crime. And so on. The missive never reached the second emperor. Zhao Gao's henchmen threw it out. They crushed his last hope just like that. The biography of Li Si's ending passages are horrific. The text is inconsistent on whether Li Si broke down under torture and confessed to imaginary crimes, or whether he remained steadfast and Zhao Gao interfered with the interrogation reports. Either way, Li Si was condemned to the 5 penalties. Burton Watson tells us that these are tattooing of the face, amputation of the nose, ears, fingers, and feet, flogging, and exposure of the head at the execution. But isn't that 7 penalties? I take it for granted now, but I used to be astounded at the ferociously cruel punishments ancient governments dealt out, and some people still do today. If I was trying to invent some horrible, torturous way to kill someone, perhaps for a novel, I don't think I could be as creative as some punishments used in the past. My brother-in-law talked about reading descriptions of ancient Chinese executions and how they kept him up at night. He's not normally a sensitive guy. Li Si, after having those various body parts cut off, was chopped in two at the waist. I don't need to say that that is a terrible way to go. I'm not sure if this is true or just a legend, but apparently this method of execution was so terrible it was banned. Some 1900 years later. Purportedly, a certain Yu Hong-tu was executed for embezzling. After he was chopped in two, he lay in agony and wrote out the character for gruesome 7 times in his own blood. Knowing that someone would survive this long was so horrible that the Yongjung Emperor banned waist chopping. And it only took people 1,900 years or so to think that maybe nobody really deserved to die in such overwhelming agony. In records of the grand historian Qin dynasty, Sima Qian fails to mention how most of the other executions he brings up were carried out. Imagining the various torturous methods that might have been put to use creates, for me at least, a much more visceral hatred of Qin. Meanwhile, various other officials were committing suicide because the second emperor wouldn't listen to them and they feared for their reputations. The rebel leader Xiang Yu was scoring victories, capturing the Qin general Zheng Han. Xiang Yu himself was a former general of the state of Chu who would soon butt heads with Liu Bong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me relate a striking anecdote about Zhao Gao from page 70. 8th month, the day Jihai. Zhao Gao was contemplating treason, but was afraid the other officials would not heed his commands, so he decided to test them first. He brought a deer and presented it to the second emperor, but called it a horse. The second emperor laughed and said, "Is the chancellor perhaps mistaken, calling a deer a horse?" Then the emperor questioned those around him. Some remained silent, while some, hoping to ingratiate themselves with Zhao Gao, said it was a horse, and others said it was a deer. Zhao Gao secretly arranged for all those who said it was a deer to be brought before the law. Thereafter, the officials were all terrified of Zhao Gao. Though short, this story is amazing. Even more than 2 millennia ago, we see authority changing people's perceptions of basic reality. This is a major theme throughout the passages regarding Hu Hai and Zhao Gao. It's groupthink. It's 2 + 2 = 5. Sanity is not statistical. But Li Se was no Winston Smith. What can we say about Li Se? He is a major statesman in Chinese history. On the one hand, he standardized weights and measures, divided China into the more stable provinces instead of fiefs, confiscated weapons, and was concerned with the well-being of the commoners. His life is even a commoner success story, rising as he did to such political prominence. On the other hand, the burning of the books was his brainchild. He was too selfish to resist Zhao Gao's appeals to his personal well-being, and he couldn't sufficiently stick to his principles to prevent the situation from becoming as bad as it was, ultimately dooming the Qin dynasty. But no one is perfectly good or bad. I feel sorry for him. He was a man in extreme circumstances who was moved to extreme things, not unlike the first emperor himself in that very, very basic respect. What happened to Zhao Gao and the second emperor? It's kind of inevitable. While out hunting in one of his parks, the second emperor accidentally shot a random passerby. Just thought I'd mention it. The second emperor was actually, for maybe the first time ever, upset with Zhao Gao. The generals fighting Xiang Yu and the other would-be kings of the supposedly abolished states were sending letters to the capital begging for reinforcements. There were too many for even Zhao Gao to conceal them all. Zhao Gao was almost a father to Hu Hai, or so Hu Hai saw him. Now that the second emperor was upset, Zhao Gao immediately turned on him, plotting with his brother and Yan Yue, his son-in-law, to overthrow him. The description of Yan Yue and his soldiers marching through the imperial palace, firing arrows continuously as the emperor's eunuchs and retainers all forsake him to save their own skins, reads like the finale of a novel. To drive home the themes of the story, one loyal eunuch remains with Hu Hai. The emperor, escaping into an inner apartment, said, "Why didn't you warn me earlier, before things came to this?" The eunuch replied, "I didn't dare speak out, and that's why I'm still alive. Anyone who had dared to speak out would have been put to death long ago. He wouldn't be around now." The basic annals of the first emperor and the biography of Li Se describe Hu Hai's death differently. The first version says that Yan Yue berated the emperor for his cruelty. Hu Hai, in despair over his lost empire, killed himself. The second version states that Zhao Gao conspired with the guards to trick Hu Hai into believing that Shang Yu was marching on Shanyang, driving the emperor to suicide in that way. Zhao Gao took the imperial seals and sat on the throne, but supposedly the palace shook 3 times because heaven didn't approve of him. Somehow I'm skeptical of that detail, but what is for sure is that none of the officials would listen to him anymore. Instead, Zhao Gao decided the new king would be Ziying, Hu Hai's nephew, or uncle. Sima Qian is inconsistent on this point, and nobody seems to be quite sure how Ziying was related to the first emperor. Ziying did not trust Zhao Gao, as he darn well should not have. Feigning illness to defer a visit to the ancestral temple, Ziying lured Zhao Gao to his private quarters, where Zhao Gao was promptly stabbed to death. Afterwards, because nobody can possibly be allowed to not murder a ton of people and thereby make their victories impossible to cheer for, Ziying executed Zhao Gao's 3 sets of relatives, too. Despite his prominence, Sima Qian doesn't give Zhao Gao his own biography. This isn't simply Burton Watson excluding it from his selection. There isn't one. Sima Qian didn't want to show Zhao Gao the respect of devoting a section to him. But between the biographies of Li Se and Meng Tian, Zhao Gao gets a full biography anyway. His name just isn't used for any of the titles. It's a symbolic victory, I guess. Ziying ascended the throne. Then the rebel leader Liu Beng, or Governor of Pei as Sima Qian calls him, told him to surrender. Ziying donned the colors of mourning, and did. The next month, Shang Yu arrived in Shanyang, slaughtered all the Qin princes including Ziying, and drove Liu Beng away. It was 207 BCE. Thus the Qin dynasty fell after something less than 10,000 generations. Records of the Grand Historian Qin dynasty doesn't include these chapters, but 5 years later, the gangster Liu Beng would return, defeating Shang Yu and founding the Han dynasty. The Han were the successors to the Qin, ruling a unified empire like the first emperor dreamed of. This might be a history, but from a narrative standpoint, this finale actually works. Everything wrong with the first emperor's reign was amplified in the reign of his son, and the account drips with bitter irony. The first emperor declares he will reign forever, but is immediately concerned with his own death, and his dynasty lasts a few decades before a self-proclaimed king of one of the supposedly abolished states kills his whole family. The basic annals of the first emperor of the Qin conclude with a famous essay by the Han dynasty scholar Jia Yi criticizing the Qin dynasty. I considered it a kind of bonus to see this essay, or most of it, translated here too. The essay is a classic of Confucian writing. The first emperor, it argues, failed because he ruled for power and dominance rather than for the well-being of the people. This got bleak. Part 1 was pretty standard history, full of war and death, sure, but also full of life, people advancing through careers, living their lives. But once we focus on the Qin dynasty, we have mass executions, torture, suicides, the abolishment of free speech, knowledge being deliberately destroyed as kind of proto-thought police, and the cruel, greedy, delusional people meting out all of these hundreds of deaths and turning life into a living hell for so many. As Watson puts it, the chapters on Qin are almost unrelievedly dolorous in tone. But I've been teasing at a broader theme here. As Watson writes, readers may be tempted to ask, were things under the Qin really that bad? Guys, I'm not stupid. I don't think this book perfectly describes what happened to Qin from 897 to 207 BCE. All human documentation, no matter how careful or well-intentioned, is fallible. I mentioned some inconsistencies earlier, and some of the scenes and details Sima Qian presents read too much like novels with too clear and instructive purpose too often to possibly be any kind of unbiased account. Moreover, the frequent monologues or extended conversations featured cannot possibly be literally true. There's no way that there would be exact records of exactly what Zhao Liang said to Sheng Yang, or the conversation Zhao Gao, Li Se, and Hu Hai had in their carriage following the first emperor's death. Why are these features here? There are a few reasons. We humans naturally interpret the world through stories, lively stories with more than dates and dry descriptions, and ancient histories reflect this. They contain dialogue, speeches, and other such artful flourishes, between dry descriptions. Thucydides, for example, opens chapter 17 of the Peloponnesian War with a dialogue between Athenian and Melian ambassadors, or has a certain Hermocrates give a speech in chapter 19. That kind of thing occurs throughout the book. The ancient histories from some cultures are not meant to be taken as precise, literal records, but instead as a source of moral instruction, as in some portions of the Bible. The Shurji demonstrates Sima Qian's perspective on history principally as a method of ethical instruction. This is, more broadly, a traditional Chinese preoccupation. Besides, the burning of the books occurred only a few generations before Sima Qian's time. Most of the historical records of the feudal states had been intentionally destroyed. What did he use? We don't know all his sources, but major among them was a book known in English as Intrigues of the Warring States. This is a book that incorporates historical figures, but its goal is not to be a historical chronicle. No insubstantial part of it is fiction. Instead, the book aims to show the reader how to argue their ideas well. Since Sima Qian, above all, wanted to give ethical instruction, it is not surprising that he would accept these accounts of historical figures already turned into borderline short stories and novellas. This is why, between passages dryly describing the dates of deaths and battles, there are so many passages with monologues and other novelistic touches. In an introductory essay, Sima Qian actually says that his contemporary scholars ignoring the first emperor's great deeds while only acknowledging his faults is as ridiculous as eating with your ear. Not the metaphor I would have used, but whatever. For most of Chinese history, the first emperor was anathema, cruel, superstitious, barbaric. In the 20th century, this traditional view of the first emperor came into question. Today, details like the first emperor being a son of Lu Bu Wei are considered slander invented by Confucians. The burning of the books, some people argue, was even made up, or at least exaggerated. First historians of the Kuomintang and then the communists issued re-evaluations of the first emperor. He became not a monster, but a far-sighted unifier who tried his best to end centuries of war and create peace and stability. The views of 2,000 years of historiography can't be done away with this rapidly, but today there is at least a much more sympathetic perspective on the first emperor. True, the man became isolated, paranoid, and violent, but he truly was a visionary. The tourism and archaeological interest in the terracotta army around his tomb only add to that. As far as I know, the tomb has never been opened out of fear of the Mercury and crossbows set to kill anyone who steps in, although the mechanisms would presumably have rotted by now. In 1975, a bunch of Qin legal documents were found in an official's tomb. I'm not familiar with them, but Watson states that these laws are not as harsh as the traditional historiography would have led us to believe. Sima Qian presented the first emperor's reign as so monstrous, no doubt because he was a Confucian in a Confucian dynasty whose legitimacy stemmed entirely from its moral superiority to the ruthlessly legalistic Qin. There were more personal reasons, though. Sima Qian was an astronomer for the Wu Di Emperor, or Emperor Wu, the 7th emperor of the Han dynasty. The Han dynasty was supposedly based on the application of mercy and compassion rather than on authoritarian and draconian law, that is, on Confucianism rather than legalism. But was it really? Of course not! The Han dynasty governed with basically the administrative system that Qin established, with laws scarcely distinguishable. The Wu Di emperor himself was actually ominously similar to the first emperor. Territorial expansion against the Turkic tribes, all the way to the Fergana Valley. heightened tax burdens to fund his military expeditions and construction projects, instituting ever more, ever harsher laws, foolishly sending men on expeditions to find the islands of the immortals even. Sima Qian spoke up on behalf of the military official Li Ling, whom the Xiongnu had taken captive. Li Ling had a celebrated career and shouldn't be treated as a failure for this defeat, or I think that's what the argument was. The Wu Di Emperor would have none of that. Sima Qian was arrested and spent years in prison, enduring physical and psychological torture and witnessing firsthand just about every form of brutality you can think of. Finally, Sima Qian was to be executed or castrated. In those days, it was taken for granted that he'd take the respectable route and kill himself. But Sima Qian felt he must complete the Shiji, a mission he had to fulfill for the future, no matter how the present might despise him. So they cut off his balls and let him live the rest of his life in disgrace. Sima Qian bitterly hated the system that inflicted so much useless misery on other people and on him. In writing about the abuses and atrocities of the Qin, he was discreetly condemning his own sovereign. For that, I consider him a true hero. This isn't my original perspective, of course. Watson and probably a million other writers beat me to it. Until archaeological excavations in some way produce data that appreciably alter that record, therefore, we must continue to view the Qin through the eyes of Sima Qian. If he portrayed it in particularly somber colors, it was doubtless because he wanted to warn future ages away from its errors and atrocities. He knew that tendencies toward megalomania and tyranny, and the temptation to try to manipulate human beings like so many puppets through the twin levers of punishment and reward, are present in all governments, and that one must be constantly on guard against them. That, no doubt, was the lesson he wished to convey in his depiction of the Qin. Also, to be clear, I'm no expert on any of this. I'm just speaking from hearsay in the contents of the book, which I think goes without saying, is a great book, which is kind of dry sometimes, sure, but is a great book because dryness is really completely aside from the point on a book like this. I thank the great Burton Watson for translating these passages into English. Earlier I said that the Qin Empire collapsed after one generation, in which time the first emperor and his son killed or hurt hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. But did it? Well, yes, obviously his family was wiped out. But did it? True, the Ying family no longer ruled the empire, but the empire hadn't dissolved so completely as it seemed at first. The Han maintained the unified China that Qin had achieved, as did dynasty after dynasty for millennia until the abolishment of the dynastic system itself. The laws and administration of China down to the modern day are distant descendants of those the first emperor established. Even the English name for the Middle Kingdom, China, is derived from Qin. Up to today, we speak of the first emperor and his deeds, both beneficial and evil. He remains in the popular consciousness enough for his story to be told in movies and books again and again. How many people will talk about Jeremy Corbyn, George Bush, Margaret Thatcher, or Xi Jinping 2,000 years from now? Now, it hasn't been forever yet, but whether or not he deserves this reward for his atrocities, the first emperor is immortal. This has been Mackerel Phones.
So why?
Yeah. Just, yeah.
Okay, so We know that we had a version of 史记 translation that was made by Watson, and that one literally, that one is a good version. But for scholarly using, we think we need another version. It's not a word-to-word translation. Also in Chinese, it doesn't make some sense, or it's very difficult. Watson would like to make it easier to understand and to translate the under meaning of the sentence, but not the surface meaning, not the original meaning of the sentence.
Huh.
Yeah.